Howdy, of you delicious people. I'm here today to review the first four episodes of seasons two's The Last Man on Earth. So, ultimately, I like the fact that I feel that season two feels very complicated. Yeah, it seems that ultimately there are still some goofy things going on. It does feel at some points they kind of go back to the same well a little bit, but it seems like this episode is getting a little bit more complex with their jokes, with their hilarity, or some of the stuff that they have to forcibly have Phil, aka Tandy's character, go into this season. So going into this, I thought reasonably like a lot of people would ultimately say it's like, well, yeah, in season one, like it was kind of slow, but in season two, man, does it get better? It just gets better with time, you know? Like to me, I would say that there are more interesting things going on. I think that reasonably within this second season, um, we are gonna get some time where ultimately we are gonna really enjoy this story because I think, especially in the second season, like things have gotten more into its groove. Like I think there's a lot more going on in this second season than I think that there was in the first season. A lot of the first season was just a lot of people just kind of standing around having not much to do until like something came into their life to ultimately make them go, oh, okay, well, great, we have this now. Great, we have the ability to do this now. And so, like, let's get on to this because we have nothing better to do. Let's have a whole episode or whatever dedicated to just this one thing because that's all we have going on. So, let's ultimately say kind of giving people a kind of a tee up or a lead up for this episode. So we ultimately have it in the very first season. We ultimately had it to where Phil and Carol were to be going on their own, being left to their own devices, and reasonably we have it to where really in a very short time period we ultimately have it to where Phil and Carol go their own way, but end up just really in desperation needing to come back to their old stomping grounds, come back to ultimately going and finding their friends yet again. And that's what really this second two or season two adventure is so far. Reasonably, I thought there was some interesting additions to this season, which ultimately, like, we really had it to where this one addition to this season ultimately is like, man, are they gonna go to the well like consistently for jokes of like this one thing, and they're just gonna consistently go full on for it repetitiously, and surefire enough they do. I thought it was like I thought that there was a lot of interesting things going on with this season compared to the first. I think reasonably it didn't take very long for them to just get really overly complicated or really interesting things going on to it. Um, I really liked the fact that ultimately we had seemingly at a lot of points in time where we had like Phil, of course, in this season regrows his facial hair back, like his big old facial hair back, and ultimately he has to exactly tell us like how long that took to grow out, which is like, well, yeah, it's like basically when you have it to where ultimately you have like some change between seasons one and seasons two, some breaks in between. You ultimately have it to where Phil could ultimately just bust out, growing out some more facial hair for the show, and then eventually go and shave it off again. It seems that at a lot of points, it seems like Phil is ultimately experimenting with his hair consistently. Like I think at some point when looking at it, it's like you don't have to have the most proper approach to just any kind of hair or whatever. You can just come in and show off any kind of numerous hairstyles and whatever just to be different. Um, when really looking at it, we still have Phil, of course, with all of his balls. Joke aside, we ultimately have it to where reasonably Phil ends up coming up with some very absurd ways of trying to ultimately find uh, certain characters when ultimately they go missing. Let's just say, and ultimately we have them. I would say like they have it to where they kind of experiment a little bit in this episode, but or in these seasons, or in this season so far of what I've seen. But most of it is just going back into tying mostly into story. So yeah. So let's ultimately go and ultimately talk about these episodes in a very uncryptic like sense, and let's go into spoilers. Let's crack out that double five to otherwise go into that spoiler time. So spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this show. So we ultimately have it to where in the very beginning of this, we ultimately have it to where Phil and Carol are ultimately trying to experiment and ultimately think of where they are going to hang their hats. Ultimately, it seems that Phil and Carol head to Delaware and to ultimately have it to where Carol ends up having an entire backstory about the home of where she used to live. It seems that Phil was ultimately just saying like, "Hey, how about we just live in Delaware?" And Carol was like, "No." You ultimately have it in the very beginning of season two. You ultimately have it to where it seems that Phil and Carol are just uh, like on the ground, just uh, driving a plane through this city, like an entirely empty city, where Carol and Phil are just driving this gigantic plane through this city, this like huge, like stealth, like wide looking plane. Like it was a stealth bomber or something looking plane that looks so absurd to just be just like this plane is huge looking. It kind of looks like the a Captain America plane at the end of Captain America, the first Avenger, where ultimately it's this big wide plane where ultimately they're driving through the streets with this. So we end up having it to where ultimately they go to Delaware and they end up deciding not to go to Delaware. Carol ends up going like, you know what? I'm missing all my friends. Like I'm missing all the people that we used to be in Tucson with. And ultimately, Phil is like, well, the other Phil kicked me out of Tucson. There's no way I can go back into Tucson. And so we end up having it to where ultimately that we end up having it to where ultimately Phil and Carol end up misplacing one another. We end up having it to where Carol is left to her own devices by she's bedazzling something in some gas station or some place of sorts. We end up having it to where Phil ends up going uh, on his RV of sorts and just driving off, or his bus of sorts, I think, and just goes ahead and drives off without Carol, not even realizing it. Ultimately, we have it to where he was like blaring music too loud. To where ultimately Carol was running after the RV of sorts, and we have it to where Phil was none the wiser. Eventually, we have it to where Phil ultimately realizes later on when ultimately he is to stop at some place where Carol would enjoy the viewpoint of. And so ultimately he realizes, oh my god, I lost her, but where did I lose her at? So we ultimately have it to where Phil is to make the realization that he's like, oh, okay, well, I left her at some speedy pump gas station, so all I need to do is just go and find a speedy pump. Well, eventually, while he keeps driving, there's like a million different speedy pumps because evidently this is like the most franchisable gas station known to man. So eventually, we have it to where uh, Phil has to make the consensus of where, like, what did the gas station look like of where he left her off at. And so eventually we have it to where Phil makes his way to the gas station. He remembers seeing Carol last, and we eventually have it to where Carol is ultimately not at that spot. She's at some other spot, ultimately with a wacky waving arm inflatable tube man, and ultimately she's eating Slim Jims and salsa right out of the can, and eventually she is uh, shooting out road flares to ultimately signal for Phil to come and get her. So we eventually have it to where Phil can't figure out where Carol is. So he ends up sending out trains, and he ends up sending out uh, a steamroller or whatever the one construction thing is that presses down on the ground and goes in a very slow momentum. It's a construction worker thing machine, like it's a steam press or steamroller machine. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Phil ends up running over one of his soccer balls with the steamroller, and so Phil ends up getting all like upset because he's like he can't do anything right. He can't find Carol. He can't like he's messing everything up. So eventually we have it to where Phil leaves a sign for Carol saying, "Hey, like I'm gonna make it back to Tucson." That's what he leaves on the train. That's ultimately what he leaves on the steamroller. So he's gonna make it back to Tucson, so that way ultimately they can figure out exactly where they are going to be. So we have it to where eventually Carol sees the train that ultimately says like, "Hey, Carol, I'm not on the train. Meet me back in Tucson." And ultimately, Carol goes, "Oh, okay, great." And so she makes her way back to Tucson. So we have it to where Phil makes his way back to Tucson to realize that his home has been burnt down, seemingly for the most point, with all of his stuff that ultimately he thought was valuable is mostly kind of burnt down to a crisp and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where Carol meets Phil back in Tucson, and so ultimately we have it to where seemingly that no one is there. Phil's not there, Todd's not there, Melissa's not there, nobody's there. Neither is Erica or Gail, no one. Not even the other Phil. So we end up having it to where Phil and Carol just assume, okay, well, I guess we're just going to be living in Tucson then. I guess we'll be fine. I guess they all moved away. And so eventually we have it to where ultimately Carol is to say, well, you know what? It would be great to have like our friends back. I wish we could just have our friends back. So we ultimately have it to where Phil ultimately like finds some like mannequins of sorts that ultimately look like Melissa and Todd and a fatter new Phil and so on and so forth, and so they just kind of have to just pretend that ultimately all the people are still there, and we end up having Carol ultimately crying about it because like it's not her actual people, it's just all mannequins. And then Phil ultimately yells at new Phil, and he loses his head and falls over because he's not a real person. And so we end up having it to where Phil is to try and comfort Carol, and then eventually he notices a note that ultimately says, "Hey, Carol, we had all gone to Malibu, and ultimately just don't take Phil with you if you're still with him." So we end up having it to where Phil ends up receiving this note, and he ends up hiding it away from Carol because ultimately, if Phil can't go, then neither could Carol, kind of thing. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up hiding the note, and reasonably we have it to where Carol is just kind of just going about her days, and eventually we have it to where Phil needs to forcibly, like, to make Carol happy, bring up the note. Basically, to the point of her just saying, like, well, if, like, why did you hide this from me? And Phil ultimately says, like, well, I hid it from you because ultimately, like, I can't go. Like, I can't go to Malibu. They won't accept me there. So, like, what was the point of giving this note? So we end up having it to where reasonably Phil finally accepts the fact that he's like, well, Carol, how about we go to Malibu? How about we just go to Malibu and you'll go and you'll meet up with the guys again and we'll just have to figure something out. And Carol's like, no, that's not going to work because ultimately they won't accept you. Well, we end up having a tour. Phil ends up getting Carol so drunk that ultimately she passes out, and Phil takes her and drives her to Malibu. And so they end up having some fun over in California, and they ultimately go to some beach where seemingly every single whale is dead and off to the side of the ocean. And ultimately, we have it to where Phil is making all kinds of whale puns and jokes and whatever. So we eventually head our way to Malibu, and we eventually find it seemingly that that the whole entire crew, ultimately with Melissa, Todd, Eric, Gail, Phil, and so on and so forth, are ultimately with seemingly a new guy that is ultimately called Gordon, who is actually Will Ferrell. Um, and and they're all singing the song Informer, bizarrely. Like, you boom boom down, whatever the F that song was. It was hilarious. But anyways, we also have it in this show. We also have it to where there's an astronaut that is ultimately orbiting Earth. We ultimately have it to where there's a guy named Mike Miller who is ultimately just looking for parts of the Earth where there are people left. It seems that ultimately he is talking to some worms of sorts or some kind of insects of sorts. Eventually, it seems that one of the insects ends up dying, and he ends up shooting it out of space, or he ends up shooting it out of an airlock. So ultimately, the thing just floats off into space. We end up having a tour. He bizarrely like jokes about jerking it to two of the insects because like he's the only one I guess left on this spacecraft, and he's basically losing his effing mind. Um, Reasonably, I guess that is to assess uh, that is ultimately Phil's brother. I don't know if that guy will actually be of any tie to any portion of this story, because when looking at it, he's probably gonna die out in space. Because unless he figures out some way to be able to make it back to Earth, because eventually he's gonna run out of resources at some point. Um, but anyways, so the scenes of just the Miller character are just kind of odd and bizarre. But anyways, so moving on. So we are back at the beach, and so ultimately we have it to where Carol ultimately makes her way to the people singing Informer, looking their boom boom down. And so Carol makes her way down there and ultimately says boo. And we ultimately have it to where Will Ferrell ends up going down and having a heart attack. Ah, I have a heart attack. So we end up finding out that I guess Gail seemingly ended up quickly being romantically tied to Gordon. I believe his name is Gordon. I could be saying that wrong. This entire time I could be saying it wrong. Gordon, no, good, all right. So, um, reasonably, we end up having it to where Gordon ends up having a heart attack, and because of Boo, scared the crap out of him, I guess. So we end up having a funeral service for Gordon. It seems that ultimately that Todd had taken Gordon's death really hard to the point where he's just consistently crying about Gordon's death and reflecting on Gordon's death. We ultimately have Gail, who is consistently uh, like having these moments of mourning for Gordon's death. Like this guy that was barely on the show, they were taking so much time to mourn for this guy's death, and so ultimately we find out when Carol gets back in the mix of people, and a lot of people are kind of hating on Carol because she had caused Gordon's death. We ultimately have it to where Carol is kind of talking to them about Tandy or Phil. And ultimately, we have it to where a lot of people are ultimately just kind of frowning on the fact of Phil. And we ultimately have it to where Carol eventually is to just mention to the whole group that Tandy had died. That ultimately Tandy had died by jumping off the Grand Canyon because bizarrely, like, Carol was trying to do a headstand off of the Grand Canyon, and ultimately Tandy had tried to save Carol, and Tandy had went into the Grand Canyon and fell instead of Carol because ultimately he was saving her, and saving her ending up had him fall into the Grand Canyon and die. We end up having it to where Carol ends up basically showing zoomed in pictures of what Carol drawing wise had made Phil look uh, dead at the Grand Canyon. It's just kind of interesting and or funny. So we end up having it to where Todd is kind of happy um, that Phil is honestly dead because ultimately of how much that Todd had almost like killed him, or Todd had almost been killed by Phil at some point, to where ultimately Phil most of the time had wanted people dead at some point. So we end up having it to where like there was so many lies and so many dissension or so many deceiving things and so many times where Tandy wanted to kill everybody. So everybody is just kind of like really angry at anything that Tandy had done. And so when Carol brings up about like any of the things that they could have mentioned about Tandy, like everybody starts muttering all these kinds of things. So eventually we have it to where Carol is consistently going to her RV to report to Phil about what they are talking about, what's going on. And we end up having it to where most of the time nobody's reflecting on Phil at all, or reasonably a lot of times people are honestly saying negative things about him. And so ultimately Phil is ultimately just getting more and more hurt by just ultimately thinking like, you know what, maybe I don't want these people, maybe I don't want to be with these people. But then eventually we have it to where at some point that Phil goes out of his way to gun in hand to stick up all these guys, all these people, to ultimately tell them how sorry he is. And ultimately one by one apologized to all of them at gunpoint. And I think that this scene is the most hilarious thing that you have. To ultimately, there's some people that are ultimately just like, they're grabbing for their pockets, and Phil's like, "Put your hands up!" Like, don't go in for your pockets. And we have like Erica's like, "Dude, I don't have any pockets." And he's like, "Well, I thought you had pockets. I'm sorry." Like, you ultimately have it to where like Phil's pointing the gun at Todd, and they're like, "Don't be a hero, Todd." So we end up having it to where one by one Phil is apologizing with gun in hand to all of these people, and consistently having their hands raised. And to the point where eventually, while these people's hands are raised, eventually they also have to ask a question, so they have to raise their hand even higher. And so, because we end up having it to where Carol was going to reveal that Tandy is still alive, and everyone was going to be upset about that. So we ultimately have it to where Phil never reveals himself, but then eventually he ends up just kind of running in on them with gun in hand to ultimately just apologize to them. So what they end up doing is they end up having him rejoin with them, but because ultimately he says that he's changed his ways, he's a different guy, and he ultimately says that kind of Carol had helped him be a different person. But I think that Phil ultimately is just trying to be a different person because I think it's the right thing to do. So we end up having it to where the new Phil and all the other people decide that Phil can rejoin the group, but he has to be in some kind of bizarrish punishment that seems to be a thing that never ends. So, seemingly. So, we ultimately have it to where at first that Phil is to be, uh, he is to be, like, put in this old fashioned, wooden like piece that ultimately is to be like holding out his head and his hands. To ultimately he's kind of like stuck with his head and his hands. To ultimately he can't be able to move very far, and he's stuck like that for days. Ultimately, we have it to where Melissa ends up giving him water, but ultimately he can't reach it because his hand is here and his head's here, and so ultimately he's desperately trying to fling the water to ultimately so that way he can drink any of it. Like, it's a very horrific kind of punishment, but it's hilarious. Also, we end up having it to our new Phil ends up coming to Phil with a gun and ultimately saying like, "Hey, you like to play with guns, huh?" And so he like fires it off, and we ultimately have it to where ultimately one other person ultimately comes out and he's like, "Hey, like, you seriously playing with guns around Phil?" and Phil ultimately, and new Phil ultimately says like, "Well, it's just blanks." But then he ultimately ends up like shooting a pot to ultimately just kind of prove that Tandy is ultimately gonna get scared from all this, and eventually he craps his pants. And ultimately, we have it to where Phil desperately asks for new pants from Carol, and ultimately he gets new pants. So we end up having it to where ultimately we find out that the cow had gotten a electric shock collar, ultimately to not be able to leave certain grounds, so they can keep the cow there because they're starting to run out of resources, with the exception of just the cow. So we end up having it to where reasonably that they end up taking the cow out of the quasi fenced in area to have Phil now be with a shock collar in this certain area as punishment, because we end up having it to where before he was in he was in this one house to ultimately be shunned away from everybody for 5 weeks, because we ultimately have Phil who added weeks on to ultimately just prove to everybody that like his punishment will be uh, the rightful punishment, but then eventually he ends up sneaking away to ultimately try and get some lavish cheese, and we end up having Melissa end up finding that he was uh, running off to eat some lavish cheese, and so ultimately we end up having it to where that's where he gets the shock collar treatment, and that's where he goes into the one portion of part of this environment. So we end up having it to where ultimately people are teasing him with items so that way he would get out of the place and consistently shock himself. We ultimately have it to where consistently Phil is trying to find some way to butter up to people. And so ultimately we have it to where Phil is consistently talking to people, like talking people to death whenever he sees them, just to butter them up. And that's just irritating the crap out of them. So that way they ultimately tell him, it's like, well, Phil, like, you know what? Like, this whole you being in jail thing isn't good enough. We now want you to shut up. And so ultimately we have it to where they add another collar that ultimately prevents him from talking every single time he'll get a spray in his face. So we end up having it to where now Phil is playing basically charades with people, or we end up having it to where Phil is whispering to people, like Carol, that ultimately will actually talk to him. We eventually have it to where Melissa ends up having a big bucket of beer that ultimately Phil can't get to, and eventually he ends up just throwing pots out of anger. We eventually get it to where ultimately that we have Phil just kind of sleeping on the ground. Like he doesn't have an actual bed in his spot. He's just basically sleeping on the ground. And so we eventually noticed that seemingly that some of the people who ended up kind of ruckusing through the house, eventually maybe uh, smacking into things or accidentally dropping things or whatever, we end up finding out that Phil notices that there is a fire going on at the home. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where Phil ends up scrambling while getting electrocuted to take a bucket of water and tossing it onto the flames while consistently getting shocked. And also, he can't say anything because getting sprayed in the face, because he realized that ultimately he could start clapping or start doing some kind of sounds or doing charades or whatever to help people figure out what he needs or what he wants or whatever. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up repetitiously taking from the pool and shoving it into the flames to ultimately douse out these flames. And eventually we have it to where everyone wakes up the next day and realizes, I guess, the house is on fire and ultimately someone had taken care of it. Because we ultimately find out that ultimately they had rigged up some kind of confinement for Phil to be in further than his fenced in environment. We ultimately have it to where ultimately Phil was seemingly in this little solitary confinement thing, this little tiny box that ultimately Phil could have easily gotten out of, and hence why like he was he was sleeping on the grass before, but then eventually he was in the little confined tiny space, and I thought that was just absurd. Like you would think sleeping on the grass would be hard enough, but I guess in that little confined space, I guess was even harder. I guess bizarrely. So we end up having it to where Phil ends up going and rescuing these people, and then eventually we have it to where uh, Phil now has to explain what had happened the night before, and we end up having Carol doing the whole charades thing, basically lying and adding a bunch of stuff in that Phil didn't actually say, and whatever, what have you. to ultimately just tell the entire story without Carol's actual knowledge, but she knows everything because the script will tell her to. So we end up having it to where everybody finally says, "Oh, okay, well, Phil, like, you're now resolved of your punishment. Basically, you saving our lives ultimately means that you are, like, resolved of everything." So we end up having it to where they finally take off the leashes and collars and whatever for Phil. And so ultimately that means that Phil is ultimately thanking everybody and nobody wants to listen to him. Everybody's just like, nah, whatever. Like, yeah, he finally did something good. Huzzah for him. But we have it to where ultimately, because we had it to where, here's also a thing. So when we had it to where Carol got into the mix of all these people and Phil wasn't there, the Tandy, we end up having it to where ultimately Carol was making out with new Phil because ultimately Phil and Carol, or Phil and Erica, had broken up because evidently they became a relationship. But then eventually they broke up, and then Carol and Phil seemingly new Phil were almost getting back together. But then eventually we had it to ultimately Carol tried to resolve all that to ultimately say no, like, we're not going to get back together. I'm ultimately going to be with Tandy because he's still technically alive. So reasonably, that kind of just resolves all the stories, that resolves everything that's going on. And so ultimately, towards the end of that episode, we end up having to where Phil ultimately is just saying, like, hey, like, I think I'll be a good addition to this thing. And so ultimately, we'll see. Like, I still think that Phil has a punishment still going on, but like, so I think everyone is still going to hate on him. I think everyone is still going to treat him like garbage, and like, I think that this punishment is just not going to go away. So we're going to end up having it to where Phil is going to have to try to consistently try to make amends. And in the end, I think Phil are going to be butting heads at some point. And ultimately, that's going to lead to somebody probably moving out or moving away or whatever. So we'll see what happens with the rest of this story. But other than that, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.